Here's the thing.
Okay, let's get it.
There's a green room. Are you ready, Michael?
What I did,
I don't know, we had a big army in Europe for that.
yeah, but I mean, I was in Stuttgart, but the commander resides at the Mons military because they're closer, because that's kind of where the military component of NATO is.
Tom Byrne, I'm the president and CEO. Our organization's mission is to promote greater cooperation, understanding, and awareness between the peoples of Korea and the United States. In accordance with the mission, the Korea Society develops programming that spans across multiple fields: arts and culture, education, business, economics, and policy. We're always delighted to work with our friends from the National Committee on American Foreign Policy on insightful programs that cover multiple facets of the U.S.-ROK alliance and also Korea and the U.S.'s place in the world. It's a pleasure to partner again with the NCAFP on today's program on the global role of the U.S. dollar. NCAFP's President, CEO, Ambassador Susan Elliott will introduce our distinguished speakers for today's program. Before I turn the podium over to Ambassador Elliott, I would like to briefly note that Celia Mosen argues that the U.S. Treasury has used a strong dollar policy as a weapon in the last several decades, and how that strength and America's consequent role as a democratic superpower may now be in question.
President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and Tom's counterpart. I want to thank you, all of us, for joining not only today in person, which to me I'm starting to treasure that we can get together and not have to just do things online, but also thank you to those of you joining us virtually for today's discussion. For those of you who aren't familiar with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, it's a non-profit, nonpartisan policy organization. We focus on informal diplomatic dialogues, which are better known as Track 2 discussions. We also look for, when we do those discussions, they are among parties in conflict, different countries. For example, we host dialogues between the Republic of Korea and Japan. We also host dialogues focused on how countries of the region should deal with North Korea. So that in and of itself is something that gives us a close bond with the Korea Society. But in addition to that, we hold special private roundtable discussions for our members and experts. We also have an emerging leaders program with next generation scholars. And again, we started that with scholars who focus on the Korean Peninsula. So another area where we have overlap and a lot of great collaboration with the Korea Society. And finally, we do public education programs like the one we're hosting today. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the National Committee, and we remain committed to hosting, leading, and partnering on vital topics that help shape American foreign policy. And as I mentioned, a lot of our work, especially over the last 20 years, has focused on Northeast Asia, and in particular Korean Peninsula issues. So we are very fortunate to be, now that we've moved just about 2 blocks from the Korea Society, and really look forward not only to continuing our close relationship, but even doing more over the coming years. In addition to Tom Byrne, I want to thank Jonathan Corrado, who's the Korea Society Director of Policy. We also have Chelsea Andre, who's their program officer, and the whole team at the Korea Society, because I can see that you've got great IT people who are recording and broadcasting today's program. So Tom has kind of set the scene for what today's discussion is going to be, so I won't really go into a big detail, but I will just say that America's strong dollar policy has been the hallmark of our stability and prosperity. So when I heard about Celia's book, I thought this would be a great opportunity for us to have a discussion about it. And Jackie Adams, who is going to interview Celia today, is a member of our board of trustees, and she suggested this would be a great opportunity for us. So I guess one of the things I'd like to hear about today is, so what happens if the dollar's value is devalued and the power goes down? and how will that affect especially our relations with the Republic of Korea and other countries, not only in Northeast Asia, but around the world.
Peace TV reporters have been active at the UN headquarters since 2010, the age of former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. They are often invited to gather pictures and news about high-level meetings and events at the UN headquarters. We usually report live on the scene the events of dozens of countries, including the US, France, the UK, Israel, Germany, Russia, Egypt, Kuwait, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Morocco, and the EU at the UN headquarters and their residences in New York. Our news reports have, in part, kept the international community up to date with the work of different governments so that people everywhere will know the great efforts and contributions of the UN to world peace, international affairs, and multilateralism.
I helped to co-found. It's a training program for rising stars of color in the media. At that point, I was tremendously impressed by Celia's work. She, at that point, was covering the Treasury Department full-time, and since then, she's been promoted to senior Washington correspondent for Bloomberg Media. In addition, she is the host of Bloomberg's marquee podcast from the nation's capital called Big Take DC. And you can hear her unpack topics about the Federal Reserve, about the dollar, whether the Russia sanctions have worked, and she brings voices from across all 50 states along with senior government officials. Big Take DC, Celia's podcast, is available on Apple, Spotify, and wherever you find your podcasts. For the last 2 weeks, Celia has been very busily promoting this book and going to events like ours. This evening, she's at the New York Historical Society in conversation, and last week she was on Fareed Zakaria, and she was brilliant. He went over on the time that he was scheduled to talk to her, which doesn't happen very often, so that's a good sign. You can buy the book on the Penguin Publishers website. We have a QR code here, and it's a great late Easter or current Ramadan present, and birthdays are coming up, so I recommend that you purchase the book. Read that writing this book was a patriotic duty. What did you mean?
Yeah, I told him it was a small act of patriotism. I didn't want to overdo that. There are people who fight in wars for the country, so this is a much smaller version of patriotism than that. But there's the second sentence in the book. I write that all empires think they're special, but all empires fall. And when I wrote this and reviewed it many times, to me, that just meant that America, maybe not an empire in the traditional sense, but a superpower, we should not take that status for granted. It wasn't until I was finished with the manuscript completely and I went on this 2-hour hike and I decided no headphones. I had my phone on airplane mode tucked away in case I got lost only, and I was just going to take a moment to reflect on having finished the manuscript and just think about things. And it dawned on me that that line, I like it so much because it sums up the professional and intellectual reasons I wrote the book, which I just shared, but also a deeply personal reason. And that is that I'm a first generation born American. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. My parents were part of the India-Pakistan partition. They were both born in India, and when the British Raj fell in India, that empire fell, they experienced what happens when an empire falls. In this case, 15 million people were displaced as the British left the region and the country was split into 2 pieces. My father, a lot of oil trade is controlled, decide we're going to come together and we're going to find a way to trade outside of the dollar. I would say on the one hand, there's nothing wrong to a diversification of the world's assets and how they're used. The dollar is so central to our global financial system. It's as central and entrenched as the English language as lingua franca, that you can't get rid of it easily, so no big deal if someone else is trading bilaterally in other currencies. Especially if it makes other economies stronger, that's good for the global economy, and so that is also good for the US. But the thing to kind of watch for is what happens when there's a crisis in the world somewhere, whether it's a regional crisis, a local crisis, government instability somewhere in Latin America or Asia or anywhere else, or a regional banking crisis. If you see countries fleeing to the US dollar in our treasuries market, right there is proof that de-dollarization has not really taken hold.
Weren't working until they did. And then another great attribute of being the world's reserve currency is law enforcement, which is how Meng Wanzhou got arrested, the CFO of Huawei in Vancouver 5 years ago, because it gives us power abroad. Question, speaking of China, politicians left and right love to bash Beijing for not letting the value of the yuan increase. But wouldn't that be at the US expense? Because if the yuan is more powerful and stronger and more traded around the world, doesn't that diminish the dollar's long-term value? Thank you.
I think any currency, that's a great question, first of all, and thanks for bringing the book. I'm like thrilled when I see it in the wild. I think any currency, there's this great, if you're really into the long, Congressional Budget Office put out this great report about how other countries lost the ownership of the world's reserve assets. They looked at the Dutch florin and the British pound sterling. Usually it's the world's largest economy that owns a reserve asset. Any country that wants to own it can own it, but you have to meet a standard. So the yuan, I think the biggest case against it, and to me I only see cases against it, because it's not, the rules of supply and demand don't apply to it. The government heavily controls the Chinese yuan. What investors globally want is predictability and stability. That's why they're uncertain about America right now, because we don't have predictability and stability right now on a lot of fronts. When we had our credit downgrade, it was because of politics getting in the way of our fiscal, getting our fiscal house in order. So even if the yuan becomes this large currency, even bigger than it is, until China's government and how they run their economy is transparent, it can't compete with the dollar. One of the moments that helped crystallize for me what the book was going to be was January 6th. The insurrection happened, and setting aside everything else that you see and you feel that day, a couple of weeks after that, Bob Rubin wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post.
The SWIFT international payment system. And so it's not conducting transactions, as far as I know, international transactions in dollars. But yet, as you mentioned, it hasn't collapsed, the ruble has recovered, and it might have economic growth this year. So how does this work? Is it because the world is now, the U.S. is no longer the global hegemon, and the revisionist powers led by China are an alternative to the dollar?
I want to talk about the reckless policy of current administration, staffed by follower of Dzerzhinsky, staffed by neocons, and with this sanction to Russia, and with this terrible proxy war in Ukraine, they put us in America on the brink of the nuclear war. What is your opinion about this?
How effective do you think they are, and to what extent does that depend on whether it's just the U.S., it's U.S. and some others, or it's much of the world, which was the case in South Africa, which I've always thought was maybe the only good example of successful sanctions. Thank you.
What did you hear from the secretaries that you've interviewed regarding their view of whether our democracy will survive what we are currently going through.
The worst thing the Treasury Secretary could do in terms of
I guess I've seen. So yeah, it's got I guess exactly. Well, they're close now.
It sounded very successful. Now you're
I think he just feels